Hello and welcome to the Deep Sea podcast, Pressurised, a short, punchy version of our main feed that gets right to the scientific point. If you like what you hear and you'd like to hear the full episode, you can find it in the same feed. And now, to get right to the point.
So either way, yesterday afternoon I was sat in my office and I was just looking across the room and Dr. Todd Bond was sat there telling me his woes. And I thought, you know what, you'll do.
You really know how to make him feel special.
No, that's not true. No, it's about time we got him on, because he and I do a lot of good stuff, and he's running away doing his own thing as well. So,
and he's a great character.
Good character, solid Aussie, and obviously since being in Australia for 3 years, there's lots to discuss. We haven't really spoken about Australia that much because it is quite unique and quite interesting in many ways. So I thought, right, because you're a top bloke and you know what you're talking about, you're a guest for tomorrow, and because about 6 other people have dropped out. So
don't tell him that bit.
No, I won't tell him that bit.
We'll come around to it.
So anyway, let's go see what Todd has to say. And so who better to talk to about Deep Australia than Dr. Todd Bond, my Deputy Director at work. So welcome, Todd, to the Deep Sea podcast.
Thanks, Al. Thank you for having me.
That's all right. Let's talk about Australia. It's pretty deep, eh?
It's pretty deep.
Yeah, how deep?
Real deep.
Real deep?
It's actually not that deep. It's just a lot of deep.
It is that deep. It is pretty deep, though. It's a lot deeper than anywhere in Europe.
Yeah.
For example. It's probably deeper than anywhere in America.
That's true. That is true. We don't touch 7,000, but we nudge on the door. But yeah, we do have a lot of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, but yeah, none of the real super deep stuff. But it's still deep enough to find some interesting things.
Yeah. So this is something that is a little story that goes back way before you and I ever met, and before I came to Australia. I was on a German ship a long time ago. I think we were somewhere off South America, and Professor Julian Partridge came up to me one day, and I think someone just introduced him to GIS. It's some magical software that can create good, nice digital colouring ins. And he slipped me this piece of paper, and he just moved to Australia at that point as well. And he gave me this piece of paper, and he said, "You've got to come down to Australia and do some deep sea stuff, because look how much of Australia is really deep." And you could see, the 200-mile limit around the continent, and he had managed to colour in everything deeper than like 1,000 metres. And it was like, oh, because I think for me anyway, historically, when you think of Australia marine science, you think of the Great Barrier Reef and corals and kelp and seagrass and all these things. It's not something you'd normally associate with deep sea. So that was a little seed that he planted a long time ago. And then when I started here, you and I had that conversation, and we actually dug into that and had a look at what the actual stats are. And it's pretty impressive, eh?
It is pretty impressive. And, like you said, no one was really doing much deep work off Australia, and the figures didn't exist. I mean, we essentially wanted that first paragraph of the introduction to say, how much deep sea does Australia have? And you just couldn't find the stats anywhere. So, it took a little while to actually get it. But yeah, we wrote the paper on it around, 1,000-meter bins and trying to understand how much actual total area is deep. And what we did find was that almost half, so 48% of Australia's EEZ, not thinking about Antarctic waters, is actually deeper than 3,000 metres. So, essentially half of Australian waters is pretty deep.
But that's deeper than 3,000. Wasn't it something even higher if you take it deeper than 1,000?
There is something like 70%. I'll have to go back.
I think it was just over 70% of Australia was deeper than 1,000 metres, which is pretty nuts. I mean, it is a massive continent, right? So, like you say, it doesn't necessarily have to be mega Mariana type of deep, but it's just a lot of it. And it's surprising how little information there is. Yeah. And what an amazing place it is too.
And when you think about, that's just the percentage, but Australia's EEZ is the third largest EEZ in the world. So it's not just the proportion of it is deep. It's like its actual area. Like, I think it was something like 9 million or 9.5 million square kilometres, of which, 70% is deeper than 1,000 metres. It's like, that is a lot of area.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. There's not actually that much. Well, there wasn't really that much going on. And I mean, cue us, right?
Yeah. And so there was a couple of things I found surprising that I didn't really clock when I started this, and that's several different layers to this. So first of all, Australia doesn't just own the deep sea around its continent. It has overseas territories, or whatever you want to call them. And a lot of people might not be so familiar about other places that are part of the Australian deep sea. And you've been to a few of those already, haven't you?
Yeah, so one which is particularly deep is Christmas Island. So the Christmas Island and Cook's Island, call them the Indian Ocean territories. So they sit on the subducting plate into the Java Trench.
Yeah.
So in this big field of seamounts. But Christmas Island was a wonderful place, and just kind of to the northeast is Java Trench, and it kind of the EEZ got, after some arrangements with Indonesia over many years, we actually lost a big part of that EEZ and the really, really deep part, but still a lot of it is deeper than 6,000 meters, and it drops off very, very quickly.
Just for context, last year when I was out doing the whole ridiculous deep sea Pacific stuff, Todd was out doing a big expedition on the Pangaea, ship called the Pangaea, in Christmas Island. So there's lots of new data and lots of new exciting stuff coming out of that. But we'll talk about that in a minute. So on top of these overseas territories, there's some down south, isn't there?
Yeah, so we've got Heard Island, but also Macquarie.
Yeah.
So Macquarie Island, I mean, it really abuts up to some ultra deep ground that New Zealand kind of occupy, but Macquarie is quite deep. Now, up until this year, it was only a small section which was actually marine park, but they're just going to turn that entire Macquarie territory into a marine park. So also as part of the paper that we did around trying to understand how much deep sea Australia has, what we did find is that a lot of the deep areas, so Macquarie or Christmas or some of the areas off Western Australia where we are, they're all in Australian marine parks. In fact, more than half of the marine park area is deeper than 3,000 meters. And that was pre the Macquarie being gazetted as a marine park. So, a lot of it is really protected, and it's great because it means that we get to work in these deep places that are also marine parks.
Yeah. So I think we call them marine parks in Australia, but other people call them MPAs. And so that means that the powers that be have, for various reasons, have drawn boxes around various places, and they put a certain degree of regulations. But it's not as simple. It's not a black and white thing, is it? It's not like Australian Marine Park, you can't do anything here, or you can do something here. There's layers to it of how much or what type of activities you can do in these places. Yeah,
that's right. I guess there's different areas around what you can do from a commercial perspective. So like fishing or oil and gas or extraction. There's also like habitat protection areas. So yeah, and really thinking around protecting deep sea. This is kind of what I do a fair bit now is trying to understand the pressures and the threats to these type of areas, and what are some of the things that we can do to mitigate those pressures and those threats, but also from a baseline perspective of trying to understand the biodiversity and trying to understand what's actually in the parks, so that we know what to protect. Because a lot of these places, like we'll say, millions of square kilometres, we just don't really know what's in them. So yeah, a big part of the work that we do in the centre and off Western Australia is really just trying to understand what's in the parks, in these ultra deep parks. So
that's what I always struggled with, because not even just in Australia, just on other places that I've been, is there are places which are legally protected, and you look at them, you look how deep they are, and you're like, from what? And so I think there's a sort of tendency to, even if it's something happening in the surface, a box is drawn and documents are written up and says this is now a protected area. But you got to question, what is it actually doing?
Yeah, 100%.
What are you protecting it from, and so on. So it's a little bit misleading sometimes, these big numbers about how many square kilometres of seafloor are being protected, because a lot of them are unknown. And a good example of that is, remember the first thing you and I ever did in the field when I came down here was to get on Pangaea, and we went down to Diamantina Fracture Zone down on the southwest. And there was a big MPA down there. And the first thing we did was we threw a lander down to the deepest point, which was great, and found the whole thing was a manganese nodule field.
Yeah.
And then you're like, well, maybe there is a reason for this to be protected, but it wasn't known, or at least it was, but the presence of the manganese nodule field, I think it's called the Llewellyn field or something, that has been lost, like been forgotten about, and it doesn't turn up in many, many manganese nodule studies.
Yeah, it kind of just got forgotten about, and it also got forgotten about from a parks perspective as well. Like, we as in Australia did an economic assessment for it back many, like in the 80s or 70s or 80s and stuff, and then it was like, that was it. It's like, okay, we can forget about this now. And I think it demonstrates that the work that Australia is doing around its deep sea is not continuous. In fact, it's kind of hit and miss. And so it just gets forgotten about.
Yeah, because I think that study we found was like 1982, and it said there's a great big huge manganese nodule field down here. And then we couldn't find any other record of it after 1982.
Yeah, that's it.
But I mean, there's a certain degree of, someone referred to the Indian Ocean recently as the forgotten ocean. And there is, I think, a little element of that, in that the Pacific and then certainly the North Atlantic get a lot of attention just because of the number of players and the number of institutes and actors in those regions, that there tends to be more information coming out of certain regions, not because it's more interesting or whatever. I think just geopolitically, the Indian Ocean doesn't have a lot of big major deep sea exploration infrastructure around it. And so things like that do pop up, but then unfortunately just don't really stick.
Yeah. just get forgotten. One of the things that I've definitely found kind of moving into deep sea and particularly in Western Australia is that a lot of it is kind of tucked into Australian EZ on this like eastern portion where we are. So we got some pretty deep basins, but then even outside the EZ, Wallabies Outer Fracture Zone, the Cuvier Escarpment, like there's some really nice little fracture zones. And I don't know, they're just kind of, like you said, they're just forgotten about. And I don't know whether that is from the surrounding countries as a result of the surrounding countries or whether it's not that much interest in it.
It's funny because, the sort of geomorphology East Indian Ocean is really cool, I think. So is the West, but we don't go over there very often. But certainly from sitting here at the edge of the continent, I mean, there are these beautiful fracture zones and ridges, escarpments. There's like the 90 East Ridge. And I remember when I wrote that book 10 years ago, I put a figure in there showing exactly that. The East Indian Ocean, I said, there's not many places where you have a fracture zone, an abyssal plain, and a trench, and, like almost like one of everything in a very localized place. And the East Indian Ocean has that. And then there's the 90 East Ridge, which basically kind of bounds it off. And I think I wrote something in there saying this would actually be a really cool place to test a lot of ecological theory because you're taking out a lot of variables in terms of studying a fracture zone in one place and a trench which is 15,000 kilometers away. It's all tucked in this nice place. But now we've got a greater appreciation of like the shelf area. You've got these canyons as well, right? And Australia's got quite a disproportionately large number of canyons.
Particularly the ones off Perth. Like Perth Canyon is one of the largest in size canyons, in Australia. And it's literally sitting 40 mile off Perth or 40 mile off Fremantle where we are. So it's, I mean, it's right on your doorstep. And the beautiful thing that I think we're kind of touching on, not only just the features, whether it's a fracture zone or a trench, but the degrees of latitude that we're able to operate in. So, we're working down to, I think it was like 34 degrees south. And then Christmas is sitting at, I don't know, just under the equator. And so you got these amazing places, these abyssal plains or these basins, but with 10, 20, 30 degrees of latitude between them. And all of a sudden, and we're sampling all across them. So you can get these really beautiful kind of trends and try and understand how latitude or productivity or all those things together are contributing to the organisms that we're seeing at 6,000 meters or 5,000 meters. It's really cool place to work.
But then you've got the opposite problem, because I remember when I was putting together a proposal when we were selling the ship, and I was asked to produce a document that says, where are the 10 places in the world you'd want to go? If money is no option, list all the cool places. And we put them all together, and one of them was Macquarie, because there's a couple of nice trenches off there, which are right down, south of New Zealand.
Yeah.
I thought, down there, that's going to be awesome. And we would put it back to the expedition team and so on and so on. And they came back and they went, yeah, there's a pretty tight weather window for working south of Macquarie. I'm like, how tight? He goes, there isn't one.
You got 48 hours sometime between January and December.
Yeah, it will take you a month to get there, and there's a good chance you'll walk away with nothing.
But even here, we're trying to do some work off the coast at the moment, and I need a day, and we're just getting absolutely belted. For some reason, it just... The WA coast, it's a windy place, mate.
I know, it is great though, thinking that, there is a canyon right off here and you can get to 4,000 meters of water and by lunchtime, But I think you're right, it is really funny, because remember last year, because for those who don't know this, our lab's kind of split in two major projects. So at the moment, loosely speaking, I run off on the ship with the sub and Todd does all this East Indian Ocean stuff, but there's a lot of overlap, so we don't actually see each other very often face to face. And there was one occasion last year where you're texting me going, the weather's a glass off, this is like the coolest thing in Christmas Island, and we're getting smashed to bits somewhere between Mexico and Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific. I'm like, yeah. And then the tables turned, because earlier this year when I was up at Nova Canton, we're like, I've never seen weather this good in my life, and you were just off the Abrolhos Islands and got nothing done in 10 days.
Yeah, absolutely belted. We poked our head around the corner outside the islands and just went, nah. We're talking like 6 meters and 40 knots blew for like a week.
Well, that's always really surprising, because if you think of yourself, if you conjure up the mental image of offshore Australia, like even pretty close offshore, you would think it would be an easy place to work, but it does have some really peculiar weather systems that...
If it's not wind, it's swell. Yeah. That's what we're getting. That's what we're getting hit with at the moment. If it's not blowing 30 knots, it's 6 meters.
But it is pretty cool though, because we have a long-term observatory out in Perth Canyon, and like you were saying, you just need a day. But you've got to think about how weird that is for a lot of scientists to think that we can go out to 4,500 meters of water and bring our long-term observatory back on a one-day charter.
Yeah, so cool.
Yeah, it's just the weather.
Yeah, that's it.
So of all the stuff you've done off Australia, deep sea, what are the highlights?
Good question. There's got to be the very first deployment that we ever did with the landers built here in WA. I think that was a pretty special trip.
Yeah.
I was on Pangea, was proving a lot of things, was new kit. It was deploying to the deepest place off mainland Australia, what we think, and then filming fish, and then also catching fish. It was just like, what? And, that was really my first, apart from that pressure drop trip the year before, that was kind of the first trip that we'd done as a centre.
Oh, it was.
Yeah. And it was like, oh man, this is easy. We're catching snailies like 6,000 meters all the time. This is easy.
I remember having that conversation. We've got 3 brand spanking new landers on deck, never even been wading water. I remember you and I having that conversation going, it feels like we should start shallow and work our way down to deep end. But right now, if we drop this to 20 meters, there's no means of getting it back.
Yeah, right.
So should we just fire them down to the deepest point straight off the bat? And we're like, well, hell yeah. No, that was cool. That stands out for me as well, because we operate these landers from the bottom of Diamantina all the way up the Naturalist Plateau and back to Perth again. That was actually, in hindsight, quite a significant demonstration of what you can do with the right backing. In this case, Minderoo gave us some money and they gave us access to the ship and said, "Go for it, guys," and did it. Yeah, it's great
for sure. I think Christmas Island for me was also really successful. I think it was probably the most successful voyage that I've been chief scientist on, and just from a weather perspective and being places where no one's been before, and that there's just so much going on, collecting a lot of species, filming some sharks. The island itself is incredible. That was a pretty special one. But Diamantina is a soft spot in my heart.
Well, let's talk about hagfish.
Oh yeah
They're
slimy little things, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to tie this back to the podcast because we need to get those hagfish to Tom, and Tom needs to get them to Andrew Stewart, who also does his little thing at the end of each episode. So this is a public service announcement saying we need to deal with these hagfish.
Yeah, so these hagfish are a thorn in my side at the moment. We have a few issues with them, which we can't go into too much detail just yet. But as soon as we can, we will try and get them over to Andrew Stewart. But yeah, we caught 2. One, I'm going to say maybe 40 centimeters and one maybe 20 centimeters,
right?
At about 3,000 meters off Christmas Island. And you know what they're like. Listeners probably know what they're like as well. They're super slimy, and these things got caught in a netted yabby trap type contraption.
Yep.
And just destroyed the trap, just absolute slime and gunk everywhere. But from what I hear, they're pretty special little specimens being that deep, right?
We'd have looked into this at the time. I would have thought they were the deepest ones ever by quite a long way. But it turns out our mate Jeff Drazen saw them off Hawaii at 3,003. So I think he just clipped us. But these are really deep for hagfish. I wouldn't normally expect to see hagfish much deeper than 1,000, maybe 1,500 meters pushing it. But 3,000?
Yeah.
That's pretty rare.
So why Christmas then?
Don't know.
Bit warmer, bit steeper, bit more food.
But there's lots of weird stuff about the Indian Ocean, remember? Because it was a Java Trench where back in 2019, when we were doing the 5 days, we threw a couple of landers down and you see the usual stuff and flicking through the video. And then there was that Dumbo octopus. And we're like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Why is there an octopus at 6,000 meters? And then the next day, put another one down, another Dumbo at 7,000 meters. So that put 2,000 meters on all cephalopods, and then never really, ever really seen them that deep again.
Yeah.
It's just like, so the deep Dumbos only live in the northeast Indian Ocean, or?
It's an interesting one because it's like, is it a niche thing or is it a functioning thing? Is it a physiological thing? I mean, I know we've been speaking about this a little bit in the centre lately around kind of niche partitioning, and these animals, or many animals, have the capacity to go deep from a pressure tolerance side of things, but they just don't, whether it's because it hurts a little bit and they're not as fit.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's like why go and be uncomfortable when you don't have to?
Yeah, this whole deep sea thing is exhausting.
Yeah, right. Like why go to 5,000 meters when I can just sit at 4,000 meters and function perfectly well and have a very successful life amongst no competitors?
Do you know? I feel exactly the same most days. Why do we put ourselves through this? Why do we keep trying to push it deeper and bigger and longer and more? And why can't we just work on like salmon or something, or mackerel, and then go and do bucket and spade size?
I thought you were going to say coral reefs then for a sec. I was like, nah.
I wouldn't be trusted around a coral reef. I'd be arms and legs everywhere. I wouldn't ever get that past any health and safety or ethics permitting. So no, I've got to go deep to stay clean. But yeah, it's exhausting. I completely sympathise with these animals. It's ridiculous what we do, but very funny. For me, anyway, going back, I thought the wallaby zenith fracture zone thing was really exemplary in terms of big, beautiful, big feature. I mean, technically it's not in Australian waters, but it's probably Australia's by far the closest place to it. But that's where we found these really big, dense manganese nodules, and we're driving the sub up on top of seamounts, and it came up to like a lizardfish, and it was just a really great trip. That the weather got a bit bad towards the end, but it was just a really. I think that for me was a significant trip in the last 5 years because it was the first time we were let loose scientifically without any other agenda for the trip. And we really proved what the sub could do in terms of number of dives, number of landers, mapping something really big and significant and coming back with some, the images that we never thought we'd get. I thought that was a real turn. I think Diamantina was special for the centre. I think the wallaby was real special for just the last 5 years and basically a big uptick in what we can do.
You're 100% right. So that was my first trip, like first deep sea trip. And I will never forget the images, the video of that manganese nodule field. It was like a ball pit.
Tell me about it, yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, this thing, like from an ecological perspective, there's animals living on them and amongst them. And it's like, how does this thing function? How do these animals function literally living in a ball pit?
Yeah.
Like there's no space anywhere.
Yeah, it's brutal, but things do, right? There were
100%.
many, I think, living on it, but those are really tough dives. I think we spoke about this on the podcast at the time, but they were tough dives because you're coming down and you've got nice white, clean, light browny seafloor against a dark horizon. But when you're staring out to like a billion cannonballs all beautifully lined up and they're all black against a black background, it's really exhausting doing that because your eyes are constantly making shapes and making patterns in these balls that aren't there, it was pretty intense.
Yeah.
But amazing, absolutely stunning.
Yeah.
I think I've never seen anything quite like it since.
Yeah, I'll never forget that. I think most people really think of those manganese nodule fields as like those knobbly little kind of gravelly bits, but yeah, just that.
These were the size of baseballs.
Yeah, and smooth, like really nice and smooth and all perfect size and same size and stuff. That was really cool. That was actually a fantastic trip. That was one of those ones as well where, like you said, we got hammered by weather. And once again, we got hammered by weather off Perth Canyon. Yeah. We continue to go to this. It's like we're cursed for Perth Canyon. We continue to go there. Yeah. And we only ever get 1 day of work. It's like, this thing is so close, but it's so inaccessible.
Yeah. It's funny because that was a trip that the total trip for me was like something in 90 days on the ship because it was during the pandemic and so on. And we'd already done like 2 months. And it was the first time I ever met you face to face. We pulled into Dampier, which is right up in the north. And it's the first time I'd ever really properly been in Australia, to be fair. I've been up and down a few times to Perth, whatever. But, in terms of outside of a city. And then we pulled into Dampier and it's like, oh my Lord. All it was just iron ore everywhere, big heavy machinery, just absolutely industrial, like big ships turning up, getting pulled, filled full of iron ore, and then off they go. And then we sort of turn up, and there were some of the roughest dudes you've ever seen handling the ropes. And then you look over the side of the ship, and it's just a lone shark circling. You're like, what? It's like Mad Max.
Dampier is a wild place for me, and I grew up in Australia. Like, it is the center of iron ore in Australia. It is deep red rocks. It is hot. There's flies. There's no trees. The environment around it, like the marine environment, is stunning. I spent a lot of time up there diving and doing shallow water fish stuff up there. Absolute stunning marine environment. But yeah, it's rough. It's a pretty rough place.
It's a combination of what a mining infrastructure on Mars would look like if it was crossed with Mad Max.
Yeah.
It was beautiful to see. But what struck me is when the sun goes down and the colour of the whole landscape turns to that purple colour. That was really, really cool. Yeah. I really like that. But no desire to go back up there. The other weird thing was, remember, this is where it was off Australia. We saw the skate. We're talking about skates on the podcast recently at 3,000 metres as well, which is exceptionally deep for skates. There's been quite a lot of interesting little finds around here. So
that's in a place, that's off the back of Rolly Shoals. And again, it's in another marine park, but somewhere where nobody goes. So I think we kind of termed it North Australian Basin, but like no one is going out there doing stuff. It is a fair way away. It's in Australian waters, right on the edge of Australian waters. But yeah, some super interesting things. One of the other ones was the ripples. So we're getting ripples down at like 1,500 meters or something, like decent sand ripples. You're like, wow, there is some serious kind of currents and water flow, hydrotidal flow going on at this depth. Super cool place. And That skate, how deep was it? It was 3,000, wasn't it?
I think it was almost 3,000 on the nose, which is
Yeah.
really quite impressive. It was quite a skittish thing, though. It wasn't a particularly brave-looking animal. It seemed to be rather timid, but it was a big old girl. Yeah, all of that trip was great. So the question, Owen, how much have we done now? How many landers do you think we've done off Australia now? Are we up to 100?
Oh, yeah, to be close.
That's nuts, isn't it? It's funny talking about this. We've done quite a lot in the last 3 years. I'm really quite impressed.
Yeah, no wonder I'm going grey.
Yeah. All right, this is one of the weirdest interviews I've done because I know you're in the office next door. So for the benefit of the podcast, I have to thank you very much for your time. And I'll see you in about 2 minutes for a coffee.
Cool, let's go get lunch.
All right, cheers, mate.
Thanks, Al.
All right, bye.
And that concludes this pressurized version of the Deep Sea Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like to go into some more detail, you can find the full episode in the feed. Just match the episode numbers. We'll deep see you next time, and I abyss you already.
You're on the ride with the progress.